go from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, for the last generation, you have a choice.
The Republican candidate for governor.
Have sexual relations
and I realize that this is something he is
We're not going to
inherent.
be able to solve our problems if we get distracted by sideshows and carnival barkers.
One Republican, one Democrat, and you discuss the issues that matter in today's local, state, national, and global politics. Hosted by Steve Hickson with co-hosts John Stanberry and Franklin Chansey. This is Backfire.
Hey, good morning, Cleveland. Welcome to Backfire, another week of it. Got John Stanberry here this morning. Franklin's running a little late on me this morning. I think his alarm failed to go off or something, but we've got a stand-in for him. Bob Burris is here, representing the Liars Table this morning from the Old Fort Restaurant. Good morning.
Good morning.
Anyway, he said he heard me say a few weeks ago that Democrats didn't get up this early. We couldn't find another Democrat to help Franklin out, so he decided to come down here and dig in, right?
That's right. I'm going to support him.
Well, there's a lot of stuff going on. I guess probably the biggest headlines here locally is Hardwick closed files for bankruptcy. And, I was going to talk about Detroit this morning and so forth, but this Hardwick closed files for bankruptcy, that's coming home to us. And, they're filing Chapter 11, so that's an opportunity for them to try to rework it. But it looked like it was caused from some past pension plans.
Well, they discontinued their pension, and it's directly right now caused by the federal government. Federal government came in and demanded payment. They weren't able to make it, so once again, your big brother government has now caused a company to have to move into Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Well, Hardwick's has held on for many years. It's it's America's oldest clothes manufacturer, I think. And 133 years or something like this. So it's a shame that something like this happened. But, their competition's always, from what I understand, they've had a lot of competition through the years from overseas. Well,
I'm sure it's
China
very difficult to compete
else
with Taiwan and those areas with, they can weave the material probably cheaper. They can sew it cheaper. So I think it's amazing that they've been able to be competitive for over 100+ years.
Well, anyway, it's one that we hate to lose. There's over 200
they
employees.
state they're not losing.
No, that's right.
They're not going out of
There's
business.
over 200 employees out there, and they've reorganized. 225 employees, I believe, and Chapter 11 is a reorganization, but I don't know how they're going to be able to pay. They're talking. I didn't understand that pension plan. Something about if they pay it, they get a discount. If they don't pay it, it's over $1 billion in a tax lien that would be placed on them. Is that right?
Mind if I join in?
No, Franklin's here. Go ahead and join in, Franklin.
What I understand the issue is, and I'm not knocking Hardwick closed, but it highlights an issue that's present around the country. A lot of corporations over time have taken advantage of certain loopholes and regulations that allowed them to not fund their pension plans on an ongoing basis. They just basically gave the pension plan an IOU in effect. And because of some changes in those regulations, I think Hardwick received a notice that they were going to have to substantially fund this pension obligation right now, and it was too big a hit for them to absorb at one time. And that's the reason for the Chapter 11 filing.
Yeah, I tell you, the thing it highlights for me, though, is it's very difficult in a story like this to assign blame anywhere, probably. But what kills me is the government sells the idea that the government's here for you. But in this case, you've got the government with its rules who apparently can't see the forest for the trees. Because if you demand a payment the company can't make and the company goes bankrupt, how have you really helped any of the pensioners or the current employees? That's I can't see the forest for the trees.
Well, you're assuming that this all happened at one time, as opposed to it may have been an ongoing issue that's been festering for a long time, and it finally came to a boil.
But the point is, Franklin, the government should be in the business of making things better, not worse.
What about, let's take this right on into Detroit then. What's going to happen in Detroit?
In what area?
Well, if a judge has allowed them to, that's interesting because the Democrats have controlled that for 50 years up there, ran the city into the ground through the same problem, promising too big of pensions. But right now, the Democrats have, at least the ones up there now, have more or less looked at this and come to terms with the reality at hand. And they've said, look, we're going to have to go in and basically cut a lot of these promises that we've made to these pensioners. The unions sued them to actually block the bankruptcy. Now, the problem with that is they don't have the money. What's your alternative if you're blocking the bankruptcy? So a federal judge has now given them approval to go through with the bankruptcy and reorganize and cut these pensions.
$18 billion in debt.
Well, you can't spend more than you take in indefinitely.
In Detroit, they said 1 of 9 cases was to be solved from crime. Streetlights are burned out in the city. They have no... Basically, the city's not functioning right now.
No.
Just barely. They've lost residents right and left. But
well, that's really a big part of the problem. That's been happening over a 35-year period.
Because
the tax base
of
dramatically went down over that period.
But
wait a minute. Now, let's make one thing straight here. 35-year period, right? Has there been
Detroit.
one Republican involved in that anywhere?
In the 35 years.
In the 35 years.
Well, there's certainly been Republicans in state government.
There's been no Republican
Michigan.
in Detroit at all, and there's been a governor every now and then.
Yes.
But this is completely
Hey, Bob, this is your chance.
a triumph of Democrat policies.
Warming up.
If you're talking about the pension plan, I don't know why that became a Democratic policy.
Well, frankly, the reason
what's
the people
what's the
left
theory
Detroit,
behind that? That only Democrats give people pensions?
Well, only Democrats give unions giant waivers from federal laws that the rest of us have to obey. Only a Democrat president would go in and
Which waiver are you talking about, John?
The ACA waivers that he's given to all the unions. We have to live under the Affordable Care Act, but the unions don't because they vote for him. Only a Democrat
You mean in like
president,
all of the American businesses that got the same waiver?
Look, frankly,
what are you
all
talking
we've
about?
asked for, Republicans said, fine, you're going to give that
That's right.
waiver, then let's give it to the individuals, too.
They gave it to all the
They didn't give it to
Republican
the
corporations
individuals.
out there.
Right. All the corporations that gave him money
but you're
and all
saying
the
that
unions that gave him money got a waiver, but
But
those of
the
us that
argument
just
is-
work and pay
Your
got
argument is, though, that the Democratic government just favors unions, when in fact they were clearly
Franklin,
favoring
the reason I brought the
corporations.
unions up in Detroit was because it was the Democrat support of the labor unions which caused the huge increases in labor costs for GM and Ford and Chrysler that actually caused the collapse of the Detroit city population.
I think we're talking about pension plans more than anything, aren't we?
We're talking. It's all connected. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. Mm-hmm. The Democrats favored the unions. The unions drove up the labor costs for all the automobile manufacturers. The Japanese manufacturers, the Korean manufacturers, the German manufacturers, they came to right-to-work states, opened up plants. They were able to produce cars cheaper. That caused the collapse of the economy in Detroit.
And you don't think maybe just making some bad decisions about which cars to sell had anything to do with that?
Franklin, of course it did, because they weren't focused on producing a product. They were focused on all these social things that you all crammed down their throat.
Well, they weren't having this problem though when they were selling all the SUVs they could make, and that's what everybody wanted, till gas prices went up, and suddenly they couldn't transition to making smaller cars. They made a bad bet.
Well, we've got it now.
Even then, the Japanese manufacturers were able to make nicer SUVs at a cheaper price.
We've got it now. Government motors will make what they want to make, and then they're going to make us buy what we want to buy.
The taxpayer's going to lose at least $10 billion on that deal, and that's not
what a
counting.
deal that turns out
And
to
that's
be.
not counting the kickbacks that they got on the front end of that, and it's not even taking into account all of the bondholders, probably mostly retirees, that president of ours confiscated their bond investments and gave it to the union pension funds.
What's going to happen in Detroit?
Well, I hope that they'll be able to turn things around. I mean,
Is
there's
President Obama
there's
going to go in there
over-
and try to bail them out?
I haven't heard any discussion about him bailing them out.
Well, he's discussed it with them. It's been discussed. It's been discussed to bail California out.
California had a budget surplus this year, John.
California,
what are you talking about?
Franklin, the Democrat supermajority in California just voted themselves.
Los Angeles is in the same situation.
The budget in the state of California has completely
because
turned around
of massive
in the last 2
tax
years.
increases, Franklin, and that's why their population is leaving California and moving to Texas. And the Democrat supermajority in California just voted themselves over a 5% pay raise.
They've got a budget surplus, John.
5% pay raise. They were already the highest paid legislature in the country, and they just gave themselves Franklin, how could you say it's booming? They're losing population to Texas. They're losing population to surrounding states right and left.
I'm reading an article here, and it's talking about Los Angeles has the problem. This is probably going to affect Los Angeles next.
Well, the largest bankruptcy before Detroit was in California.
Anyway.
Weren't they supposed to put that pension liability on the balance sheet, and they forego that years ago? Trying to get, there's a lot of corporations.
How many Republicans have you seen run anything in Detroit in 35 years?
60 years, actually.
Actually, 40 years, I think.
Well, where's the old saying, as GM goes, so goes America? What happened to that?
Well, GM spent too much, ran their expenses up, weren't able to compete, and if the government hadn't bailed them out, they would have gone under.
What about the CEOs? Did their pensions get cut?
I don't know.
The guy at the top, did he go hungry? Yeah. Does he have
Probably
a job?
Not. Probably not. My concern, Franklin and I have argued over this for a couple of years now, is you had bondholders that bought bonds in GM. So they made
That's the nature of buying bonds, though.
That is not true, Franklin. You know the legal nature of that. A stockholder is below a bond. A bondholder is just like a bank. They loaned money to the company. They didn't invest in the company.
Yes,
they loaned money.
But it's an unsecured loan, John.
Franklin, was it more unsecured than a union that had a pension plan?
Depends on what's in the pension plan.
This president, without any...
There's also more involved in that, John, because there's something called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund, which is a federal plan.
I would love for you to look one of these bondholders in the eye that the president, with the stroke of a pen, wiped their investment out
John,
and gave it to a union and tell them that it's no big deal.
And you know what you say isn't true. The president did not do this with a stroke of a pen. This was a plan presented to a federal bankruptcy court.
How many bankruptcies does the
it.
president of the United States directly interfere with?
Ones that would cost the United
How many
States
times has
economy
it
about
happened
$1.5
in the
million
past? How
jobs.
many times has it happened in the past? How many times in the past has that happened?
How many GMs did we have, John?
So in other words, it's the first time. This president stuck his nose into a bankruptcy, decided winners and losers in the bankruptcy.
We wouldn't want to do anything to save $1.5 million jobs,
He actually
John.
went against law to deprive bondholders of their
because it would be so much
in a
better if
bankruptcy.
if $1.5 million people filed for bankruptcy
Franklin,
instead of this corporation.
Why wouldn't he have allowed? Why didn't he trust the federal judge that normally handles these bankruptcies to make the decision?
The federal judge could have said no on this. He didn't.
Of course he did. He's the president of the United States. The federal judge was probably worried the IRS would come down and audit him if he said no.
All right, let's get back to the Detroit situation just for a second. I'm sitting there reading an article out of the New York Times, and it talked about this ruling in Detroit is likely to resonate in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia, and many other cities. In other words, Los Angeles has the same problem, Chicago and Philadelphia. Now then, Chicago is Mr. Obama's hometown, right? So the unions are really fired up about this, and there's going to be a lot of people that, their livelihood's going to be affected by this. So I'm predicting another Obama tax spend here somewhere soon.
Actually, it's kind of hard to say because Rahm Emanuel, as liberal a Democrat as he is, has actually been pretty stark in dealing with Chicago's policies because, when he got in there, he was forced with the fact that they're going under if they don't fix this. The positive that may come out of this is if I were a union in another city and I'm looking at the same type of problem and I see what this bankruptcy court is probably going to allow Detroit to do, I may be a little more likely to try to have talks on let's see how we can work this out instead of having a hard line. Now, I've never been real encouraged by that. Eastern Airlines, for example. Eastern Airlines told that striking union, if you force this, we can't pay it and we will go bankrupt. They forced it. Eastern went bankrupt. So instead of arguing over how much you get, you're unemployed. And that's what happened. So I hope that's what happens. I hope that the unions look at this and say, we're going to have to give a little bit. We've had too rich of pensions over the years. It's not actuarially sound, and we're going to have to give.
You got any problem, as Bob pointed out, with management having to take some hits too?
The problem in these, Franklin,
Do you
this
have
is
a problem?
There's no management.
If you want to go off on that
Detroit.
tangent, that's fine. This isn't about corporations. This is government. These are government unions. These are SEIU unions.
No, I'm
SEIU,
asking
the
you-
huge supporter of President Obama. That's the problem with these cities. They're not private corporations.
What I'm
They're
suggesting
government
to you,
entities.
John, is that there's been an overwhelming trend in America over about a 40-year period for management to be completely adversarial to the union instead of asking them to partner with them. And I'm asking you what your opinion is about that.
Well, personally, I like when President Reagan fired the air traffic controllers.
That was the best day I remember.
Anyway, you mentioned this about the Hardwick Close thing.
Yeah.
As we go through the article here, this is what I was talking about. It says in this article that the company asked the Federal Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, and that's a thing like the U.S., the FDIC backs up your bank accounts. They back up some pensions.
Right.
And they asked them for help, and they came in and did an analysis of the plan and determined that they only had $11 million in assets in the plan, and it was grossly underfunded. So they told them they had to put $7.3 million into it, or they were going to put a $1.5 million tax lien on them, which basically meant that they had gotten a tax benefit by not funding this plan over time. And the company decided they couldn't do it, so that's when they went into Chapter 11.
But the point is the company asked the government for help, and what they did is they gave them a deadline they couldn't meet and forced them into bankruptcy.
But here's the thing. They've been dealing with this, it says, since 2006. Exactly when does somebody force them to do something? They didn't ask them to do it last week and this happened. This has been going on for 7 years, apparently.
Well, they thought business was going to get better.
Well,
but it hasn't
in
during this regime.
fairness, that's where some of the problems started with the economic downturn in the late part of the.
But we've been in recovery since 2009, Franklin. This is according to the White House and the government. The recession ended in 2009.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's a company, John.
This is President Obama's
using your
economy.
analogies, John. That's a company that competes with lots of businesses in other countries who work people for 20 cents an hour. Maybe if we didn't have a minimum wage,
so
we
this
could cut our
economy is
people
not
back
the
to that
president's
level.
fault yet either.
No, I'm just saying you like to use that analogy. It works both ways.
The danger here is there are a lot of corporations that are unfunded
exactly right.
pensions. That
Everybody needs to look at these pension programs. Cleveland, Tennessee needs to look at their pension programs. Everybody does.
It's not just a question, though, of wild, extreme pension benefits. It's a question of whether you put the money into them that's required to pay the benefits. And many times that's been avoided by companies because, well, they want to use the money for something else.
You mean they just what do? They just basically have an IOU in the pension fund?
That's really what's happened.
Just
Yeah.
like the Democrats have
actually
done
borrow
with
money
Medicare.
against
Just
it.
like the Democrats have done with Social Security. There's actually
The
no money.
Democrats.
There's actually no money in the Social Security
think-
fund. There's IOUs.
You don't think
Democrats
any-
started
well,
Social
I'm
Security, though.
fine, Franklin. You know what?
What you mean is what the United States has done.
Let me talk.
not the
Let me
Democrats.
give you my philosophical
Who
point.
started
Franklin. If there's
Social
any
Security?
Republicans that did it, I'm for voting them out too, because we need to be financially responsible. My problem here is you will run the companies into the ground, but the government, the federal government, is regularly taking money out of the Social Security Trust Fund and spending it on all kinds of things, and then pretending like there's all this money there. It's not there.
Okay.
Well, let's fix that, Franklin. You know what it would require?
Who said not to fix it?
You people say not to
You
because you'd have to
people.
cut spending. You can't.
You show me, John, one Republican who was in office who had the authority to do something who proposed that.
Actually,
Nobody.
Franklin, the first people that decided to put IOUs in the Social Security Trust Fund were the Democrat majority. Every time Social Security has been
Show
touched,
me when your
it's been the
beloved
Democrats.
Ronald Reagan tried to do something about that.
Franklin,
Show
I hate
me
to
when
point,
his hand-picked
Franklin,
successor,
I hate
George
to
Bush,
point this out
tried to
to
do
you.
something about
During
that.
all of that time, the Democrats were in charge of the House and the Senate, which actually makes those decisions.
The problem here, John, is that these are only issues when your people are out of a power. When they're in, then it's not a big deal. We'll deal with that later.
Well, Franklin, when we were in power, we weren't having $1 trillion a year deficits like your guy has.
Actually, we were, John.
No, we weren't, Franklin. We never had a.
Check Bush's last.
Bush's last year was when he went along with the Democrats and the Fed to do the $800 billion bailout, and that's the only reason. And guess what, Franklin? I'm glad you brought that up, because the $800 billion was supposed to be a one-time expenditure, but it's now become the baseline for President Obama's budgets.
John,
John,
there was a bipartisan vote on that stimulus that you were talking about.
Yeah, and guess what happened to a lot of the Republicans that voted for it? We, the Republican base, voted them out
That's
of office.
right, because you preferred a depression to sound economic
Well, right
policy.
now we have the longest sustained recession in the history of the country.
John, we have not been in a recession in 4.5 years, and you know
Really,
it.
Franklin, because just 5 minutes ago you were talking about the reason that they were in trouble was the terrible economy.
I didn't
now
say
the
that.
economy's great.
I didn't say that. I said in fairness to them, the problem began.
All right,
then.
let's use the word recovery. This is the longest economic recovery in the history of the country.
Well,
under
actually,
this president.
Actually, that would be
it's
the
the
second
longest and the
John.
weakest.
You remember something called the Great Depression?
You mean
right?
FDR, who did the same thing this guy's doing?
Yeah, I didn't
and
know.
And FDR
I actually
resulted in
paid attention to my elders when I was growing up, John. Apparently, like you did not. And all of those people worshiped the ground FDR walked
they're all
on
wrong.
for saving
and
their
all,
lives.
He didn't save anything,
well, it's
Franklin.
It's easy for us in our cushy lives to say how they ought to have felt at that time.
Well, Franklin,
but that man saved them.
Let me explain
and
something
saved
to
this
you. In
country as
1929,
well. And
I
by
know.
the way, he also saved capitalism.
You
in
need to
America.
go back and read the records because you're wrong. You've been taught a revisionist history, Franklin, because in 1929, after the crash, Franklin, in the
I
year
should have been watching Fox
in the
News all
year
those
following 1929 crash, Franklin, unemployment never went into double digits. And by about 8 months after the crash, it was actually going down. It wasn't until Hoover and then FDR started intervening.
First of all, where
Can
did
I finish,
unemployment
Franklin?
go,
It
Sean?
wasn't until they started intervening that it went above 20% and stayed for almost a decade. The market was actually correcting. Unemployment was coming back down. It never hit double digits. Franklin Roosevelt's policies, and started by Hoover, a Republican's policies of intervening in the market, actually caused the length and the extent of the depression that we suffered.
All right. So much for history. Let's take a break and we'll be right back.
Hey.
You're listening to Backfire with Steve Hickson. We'll be right back after this.
You are listening to WOOP.